Hello, welcome to this evening's Rosenbach Behind the Bookcase, a friend, a foe, and a fair youth finding Shakespeare in early printings. I'm sorry my camera's not working, but I will introduce myself. I'm Andrew White, and I'm the volunteer coordinator at the Rosenbach. I'll let Ed introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach, and welcome everyone tonight.
So, about what we're about to see, Ed and I will be collaborating on our presentation about Shakespeare, looking at Shakespeare in some of his earliest printings and some of his contemporaries' opinions about him and his opinions about some of his contemporaries. We are broadcasting to you virtually from the Rosenbach, which exists in two row homes side by side on Delancey Place in Philadelphia. The Rosenbach Brothers, our founders, were dealers and collectors in rare books and manuscripts, art, and fine furniture. Abraham Rosenbach was the top rare book dealer of his day. At the end of their lives, Abe and Phil set up the Rosenbach Foundation so that their home and collections could be shared. The Rosenbach House, our exhibits, and our garden are open to the public. Our reading groups behind the bookcase tours are now online. When we're fully open again, we offer reading groups in person and even biblio cocktail parties. We're so glad you are here to keep the conversation going. For tonight's Behind the Bookcase presentation, we'll be looking at some of the earliest Shakespeare printings at the Rosenbach, a book that shares the same source as Romeo and Juliet, and a cheery little rewrite of that feel-good hit we like to call King Lear. That's Ed's part. In my part, I'll be looking at two of Shakespeare's contemporaries and also at his sonnets. Ed will get us started, so take it away, Ed.
Thank you, Andrew. The first play we're going to look at tonight, or the first item from our collections that we will see, is a quarto of Merchant of Venice. And just as a reminder to everyone, if you're not used to dealing with these things, when you pick up a modern copy of a Shakespeare play, no matter what edition it is, where do the editors of these modern books get the text for the plays? Because the answer is more complicated than you might think, because mainly the publication history of Shakespeare's plays is very messy. Manuscripts from Shakespeare do not survive. Actually, very few manuscripts of any plays survive from Shakespeare's time. So what we have to do to come up with a Shakespeare play is go to the printed versions of the plays in Shakespeare's day. And actually, even the texts of those printed versions can sometimes vary dramatically. That was a pun, dramatically. I'm sure you're all laughing that I said they were very dramatically. So when a modern editor puts together the play text for an edition, they need to look at all the early printed versions. And with Shakespeare, first, it's the folio. All but one of Shakespeare's plays were printed in a big folio we called the First Folio in 1623, after Shakespeare had already died. But before the folio, many of his plays, maybe about half of them, a little less than half, were printed in copies we call quartos. And this is a quarto. And a quarto, it's about a fourth of the size of a folio, and that's hence the title or the term that it's called a quarto. And in his book collecting days, Dr. Rosenbach, our founder, had many, many early quartos of Shakespeare's plays, plays that printed during Shakespeare's lifetime. But he sold almost all of those. And what we have now in our collection is most of the quartos we have now are printed after Shakespeare's death. And Shakespeare died in 1616. But you'll look at this and you see the cover of this book actually says Merchant of Venice, 1600. Well, Shakespeare's still alive in 1600, but if you notice on the text we have on the side there, this is an edition from 1619. So you want to turn the slide there, Andrew? And this is the title page. And again, at the bottom of that, it says it's printed by I. Roberts. That I is actually a J. That's what they were still using I for J's in early printing. It's James Roberts. He was a printer. James Roberts had printed a quarto of Merchant of Venice in 1600, and then that quarto was then used to print another version in 1619, and this is actually the 1619, but they used the same title page, and that 1619 was printed for or printed by William Jaggard for Thomas Pavier. And what they were doing is they were putting together an edition of Shakespeare's plays, about 10 of them, and they were going to put them out in one collection, a collection of 10 Shakespeare's plays. But then the Lord Chamberlain sent them a letter and said, you're not allowed to print any plays owned by the King's Men. Why would he do that? Well, the King's Men, the company that Shakespeare worked for, and he was dead by this time, but they still owned all the plays that he had written for them. They probably complained. So they were prevented from releasing this edition of 10 plays. But during that time, copyright laws or copyright enforcement was very difficult back then. So the quartos individually still wound up coming out, many of them, including this one right here. And it says on the cover here, it says the excellent history of the Merchant of Venice. And it's with the extreme cruelty of Shylock the Jew towards the said merchant. So just to highlight that it is a play about this cruel person named Shylock, and it's just called The Excellent History. Now, those kind of titles, histories, any kind of narrative of no matter the type could be called a history. Then, want to go to the next one. And here is the first page of this version. It's the comical history of the Merchant of Venice. In the First Folio, when they wind up printing a different version there, it is just listed as the Merchant of Venice, but it doesn't. But it's also in the First Folio. Merchant of Venice is still listed in the group of plays called comedies. In the First Folio, it's comedies, histories, tragedies, and this is among the comedies. Well, for anyone seeing a version of Merchant of Venice, nowadays, and really a version of Merchant of Venice for the last 150, 200, almost 200 years now, it comes across as a tragedy. Now, of course, it has some comic elements in the play, but it's overall, this is a tragic play. It's this downfall of this poor merchant who, tries to get justice and maybe he wants to do something horrible by cutting a pound of flesh from the person who owes the debt to him, but he seems the one that's that they're acting against in this play. Well, in Shakespeare's play, as he wrote it and for his original audiences, Shylock is a comic villain. I mean, that's his role. The audience is supposed to laugh at his downfall. When Shylock then has his famous speech, which we can highlight for you in this book, it's the famous "Hath not a Jew eyes" speech that he gives. That he's telling his friend that we should be treated the same way as the Christians are treated, because we're humans too, and if they seek revenge on somebody for a slight, we should also be able to seek revenge on somebody for a slight. This seems like almost a cry for justice now. Now, he's still calling out for revenge, but it doesn't play as comedy for a modern audience. And it's impossible to play for comedy now. It really is. But in Shakespeare's time, this is a speech of irony. This is a comic villain calling out for his right to murder somebody in the name of justice, and that's how it serves its function in this early play. But to read it now, it's just almost impossible to come up with that same kind of feeling when you're experiencing this play right now. So, if you have any comments or questions while I'm talking about these items, please drop them into the chat. I just want to see if there's any comments about Merchant of Venice right now. I can come back to it if you think of one while I'm talking about the next book that we want to show you. feel free to drop it in there and we can always backtrack and talk about it, because our next one here is a book by William Painter called The Palace of Pleasure. You see on the spine there, we have 1567. This was actually released in 2 volumes, 1566 and 1567. It is a collection of stories, and it is the source for Shakespeare. It is the source of his narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece. It's also the source for his Timon of Athens, All's Well That Ends Well, and Romeo and Juliet. Now, the first volume came out in 66, the second in 67, and it is a collection of what you might call novels, or at least that's how Painter refers to the stories that he's telling, as novels. And that's a curious early use of this term, novels. It's from the French and Italian novella, which is basically just a prose fiction, usually a romance, and a romance meaning not necessarily a love story, but a romance in the old sense, meaning any kind of sensational or fantastical tale. Most importantly, novellas, novels here, they're not about ordinary lives and ordinary people. They're about, the upper classes or heroes and heroines. And you can see on the left here page that Painter even lists his own sources for the stories that he's going to tell. And they're all, and most of these are classical authors, but then it goes up into the Middle Ages. You see Bandello and Boccaccio and Belleforest. And they're the places that he is saying he got his stories from, because the kind of originality that we expect in an author now is not necessarily what was expected of authors in Shakespeare's day. That for a story, for one of the requirements of any story is authority, and that it should have some kind of older story that you can go back to and say, this is where I got that story from. People expect that in their stories. And this, and here he's letting them know right off the bat that I just didn't make this stuff up. These are the sources that I took it from. And that's why these stories are important to tell, because they come from important sources. And books like Painter's were, according to one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, saying that the playwrights ransacked Painter and other authors to provide the plots of English plays. If we want to go to the next here, and Shakespeare certainly does that as well. And Romeo and Juliet, you see in the title there, Romeo and Julieta, Romeo with a strange silent H in it, is one of the stories in this collection. And it is, you've noticed that it also says the 25th novel. So each one in this is like, this is the 25th novel in this collection, the 25th story. And the text right under the title there is The Goodly History of the True and Constant Love between Romeo and Julieta, the one of whom died of poison and the other of sorrow and heaviness, wherein be comprised many adventures of love and other devices touching the same. Now, both Painter in The Palace of Pleasure and Shakespeare are borrowing from other sources that contain the story of Romeo and Juliet, including a long narrative poem by Arthur Brooke called Romeus and Juliet. Romeus is spelled Romeus, Romeus and Juliet. Shakespeare's, actually his main source for his play is that Brooke poem. So both Shakespeare and Painter are drawing on another source. That not only gives their work authority, but is just the way you find stories. You don't just think them up out of your head. You hear a story somewhere else and then you reshape it in some way. And that's part of the genius of Shakespeare. Not that he comes up with plots and characters and the way to do things, but it's how he reinvents stories that he has given. And things like the Nurse and Mercutio and Tybalt in his sources are nothing like the characters that you see on Shakespeare's stage in either Brooke's poem or in Painter's, prose fiction. It's Shakespeare's genius is about making those characters come alive and doing new things with him. You can see the influence of Painter really only in Shakespeare in kind of certain word choices that he used. There's a few points in the play where he uses a word like dumps, like meaning somebody is feeling bad, you know, and he seems to have gotten that from Painter. And there's a few other places in the play where he seems to be telling the story that Painter had told, not the story that Brooke had told. But also the biggest influence, in a sense, is Shakespeare's play is called Romeo and Juliet, as Painter has it, Romeo and Julieta, and in the Brooke, it is Romeus and Juliet. It's almost like Shakespeare combines them. He took the spelling from Juliet from one and the spelling of Romeo for the other, and that's where he comes up with his character names. Any questions on Painter, the Palace of Pleasure, or Romeo and Juliet? Feel free to drop them in there. I can always backtrack after the next segment. Why don't we proceed, Andrew? The next one is, of course, the happiest love story in all of Shakespeare. You all know it is King Lear. Shakespeare's, so we go from where a source that Shakespeare uses to now looking at something in our collection which itself uses Shakespeare as a source in very much the same way that Shakespeare did with his sources too, which I'll get to at the very end here. This is a version of King Lear written by Nahum Tate. That's Nahum, Nahum Tate. And he actually, this one is dated, you see here, 1796. That's when this is published. But he actually wrote it in 1681. And this is then a later adaptation of that. Now, Tate, and this version is newly revised by J.P. Kemble, it says. That's John Philip Kemble. Kemble was the actor manager, one of the more famous actor managers of his day, and ran the Covent Garden Theater for, I think, the last 10 years that he was active. And he's also the uncle, I think, of Fanny Kemble, who's from Philadelphia and fame. And we have a portrait of Fanny Kemble in our collection as well. But John Kemble is active around through the second half of the 18th century up till about 1817 as an actor, and this version comes from then. But we think of Shakespeare's plays as kind of sacrosanct. That if you're going to perform Shakespeare, you can't just rewrite them. I can't go put on a company isn't going to put on a version of King Lear and say, yeah, we don't like Shakespeare's though, so we're just going to change everything and do what we want to do it. People don't expect to do that then now, but when the theaters reopened during the Restoration in the late 17th century, Shakespeare was just a playwright. He was not like the greatest author of the English language to ever live. He was just a playwright. So they do whatever they want with his plays and rewrite them to suit their own needs, to suit their own tastes. And so from the Restoration on, from that late 17th century throughout the 18th century, and into the 19th century, into the 1800s, Shakespeare's plays on stage were freely adapted by authors and big actors. And often in the early 19th century or the end of the 18th, they were still using the versions that had first been changed in the late 17th or early 18th century. Kemble does that here for his version. He takes Tate version and uses that. And Tate's rewrite of King Lear would be basically the play you have. If you saw King Lear from 1681 when he wrote this until early into the 18th century, I mean, to almost 1838, if you didn't see the Nahum Tate version with some alterations, you still saw a lot of Nahum Tate in there. And it's the happy ending Lear. But the biggest question is, why does Tate change Shakespeare's play? We've read King Lear or seen it. It is a stone cold masterpiece. Why would you think you needed to change it? Well, here's Tate in the very first printing of the play, in which he writes, that he had come across King Lear, and I found the whole, to answer your account of it, a heap of jewels, unstrung and unpolished, yet so dazzling in their disorder that I soon perceived I had a treasure. 'Twas my good fortune to light on one expedient to rectify what was wanting in the regularity and probability of the tale, which was to run through a whole love betwixt Edgar and Cordelia that never changed word and each other in the original. So he finds Shakespeare's play to not be a masterpiece, but to be a heap of jewels, unstrung and unpolished. It's beautiful parts, but it's a mess. And what do? I know, I'll make a love story out of it. I will take Cordelia and have her fall in love with Edgar. And that's really what the play that I'm writing. Now, Shakespeare's King Lear, spoiler if you haven't read it, is ends in the most tragic way that it can. There's very little resolution at the end of Shakespeare, because not only does Lear die, but his daughter Cordelia dies, and the fool is even hung. So they're just one death after the other at the end of it. And watching King Lear, it's not exactly a happy, uplifting experience. It's a gut punch. It is so painful at the end of that play, especially when Lear discovers, his daughter Cordelia has been murdered. It's like the bad guys won. Hey, the bad guys might get, overthrown at the end, but they've done so much damage at the end of this play. It doesn't feel like there's a victory at the end of it. Well, theater audiences in the 18th century, they didn't want that kind of depressing ending, so they just changed it. And it's a love story for Tate between Cordelia and Edgar. He cuts out the French king entirely, who in Shakespeare's version, Cordelia marries and then comes back and, to help her father. I think they don't want no Frenchies in this play about an early British king. That's what's more important to them. Cut out the fool, because no fooling around. And at the end, when I click ahead, Andrew, at the end of the play, instead of they plot for here's the ending of the play here. It's Lear and Cordelia are being held, and then Edgar actually, the guards are told to kill Cordelia, and they're just about to do it, but King Lear stands up and he kills the two guards who are trying to kill Cordelia, and then Edgar comes in and kind of they get everybody else. At the end of the play, basically Edgar defeats all of Lear's enemies. Lear lives. His other daughters and their husbands and the bastard Edmund, they're all dispatched with. And then Lear actually crowns Cordelia as the Queen of England. Now and she gets to marry Edgar. This is a very satisfying play for an audience who has already seen a little too much turmoil in their own royal leaders. After the Restoration, they didn't want wars to replace their kings. They wanted some kind of stability, and this is a play that gives them that kind of royal stability, and it's also happy at the end. The interesting thing, the last thing I'll say about this is that for people who are horrified that Nahum Tate would take a Shakespeare play and give it a happy ending, that's exactly what Shakespeare did with his source, but the other way around. Shakespeare actually has a source. There's a few sources for King Lear, but his main source is, and the one that his audience already knew was a play at the time, was a King Lear play referred to as The True History of King Lear, in which there's a happy ending, that the bad guys are defeated and King Lear and Cordelia live at the end, and there's no tragic deaths. And Shakespeare thought, I'll do my version of King Lear and I'll kill them all at the end. And it must have been completely shocking for his audience to come in and think that they were seeing a version of King Lear like they had known, and Shakespeare completely changed the ending of the story. And that's what Tate did, and that's the version that people preferred for 150 years, was that happy ending. So Excellent. There are a couple questions here. Do we know much about the early owners of these books? Were there any of them actors or producers? Not to my knowledge. Boy, I'm not 100% on the provenance of any of the ones that we've shown right now. And part of that is that I'm not in the collection right now. Since the shutdown, I haven't been able to go and really pull books out. So I don't know about the provenance of these particular copies. I don't know if Andrew, do you know anything about the provenance on these three?
I don't. Some of the books that I'm going to look at have beautiful book plates of former owners, but I didn't recognize any names.
And then we had another comment here from Lynn. She says, I heard someone say that Lear wasn't so tragic in Shakespeare's day because they had a strong view about the afterlife. I understand that an audience may really believe that sure Lear's off to heaven or the other people who were died are off to heaven, but it's a bleak ending, and there's people are jumping around at the end of King Lear saying, "Oh boy, the bad guys are all dead, and now everything's going to be fine." It's a it's very melancholic, and I think it's the nearest thing to a nihilistic play that you can call something of Shakespeare's. So. Andrew, you want to take it away?
Well, thanks, Ed. So we'll rewind back to Shakespeare's own day, and we will see a huge Shakespeare fan. Ed talked about how in Shakespeare's day he wasn't regarded the way we regard him, as the greatest playwright ever. Here's someone who actually did think that, kind of ahead of his time. This is a 1598 edition of a book called Palladius Tamia, which roughly translates from Latin as the wit's treasury. The clergyman and writer Francis Mears, this is his book. It's beautifully rebound because in this day you would pick up a book from the printer and then you would take it from the bindery, so no book really had its original binding, or very few have the original kind of flimsy paper binding. So collectors felt totally liberated to just rebind their books. So some of our books have these lovely, lovely bindings that were given them by their owners. Francis Mears was a clergyman and also a scholar. This book, Palladius Tamia, translates as Wit's Treasury or Wit's Commonwealth. Palladius Tamia, to take it a little bit closer, it probably translates as Athena's Pantry. And there's a lot of stuff crammed in this pantry. Thoughts on life, morality, religion, and literature. What ties this whole big book together is this similitude. And we'll just start with one to get us going here. As gold and a pearl make one ring, so God and man make one Christ. This book is composed entirely of strings of comparisons just like this on different subjects. I cannot think of a book, I've racked my brain, and I cannot think of a parallel genre today. Ed, if you do, just give a yell, but I can't think of any parallel book today. Looks like we have a hand raised, but I don't see a comment in the chat yet. Looks like that was Roberta, so if you have a question, definitely put it in the chat and we'll see if we can answer it. The part of Palladius Tamia that we are interested in is the comparative discourse of our English poets with the Greek, Latin, and Italian poets. You can see I've put in this arrow to the similitude, as Homer is reputed the prince of Greek poets and Petrarch of Italian poets, so Chaucer is accounted the god of English poets. I love that Homer and Petrarch get to be princes here, but Chaucer is a god. When Mears gets to Shakespeare, he compares him to the Roman poet Ovid, which Shakespeare was often compared to, and the Roman playwrights Plautus and Seneca in 3 paragraphs over 2 pages, as you see here. But let's zoom in on the passage where Mears talks about Shakespeare. So on the left is our first of about 3 comparisons that Mears has, or similitudes that Mears had for Shakespeare. It relates to Shakespeare the poet. So we see, as the soul of Euphorbius was thought to live in Pythagoras, What does that mean? The ancient mathematician Pythagoras believed that he was the reincarnation of one of the warriors of the Iliad, Euphorbius. So the sweet, witty soul of Ovid, the Roman poet, lives in mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare. Witness his Venus and Adonis, his Lucrezia, which are two of Shakespeare's early narrative poems, which were big sellers, especially Venus and Adonis. His sugared sonnets among his private friends, etc. So, just looking at this first sentence, Mears calls Shakespeare sweet 4 times in one sentence. His sonnets are sugared. He himself is honey-tongued and mellifluous. Mellifluous comes from the Latin meaning flowing honey. And he's the reincarnation of sweet, witty Ovid. Shakespeare's contemporaries are always using the word sweet to describe him, whether they're honoring him, like Richard Barnfield, who was in the same year, 1598, wrote a poem praising contemporary poets and called Shakespeare, quote, honey flowing. Shakespeare is also made fun of by having a comical character in a play written for university students to perform, one of what are called the Parnassus plays. And this character says, "Oh, sweet Mr. Shakespeare, I'll have his picture in my study." Kind of like, think of having a poster up in your dorm room. That's this situation. And this character also keeps a copy of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis under his pillow. Young male undergraduates were crazy about Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. They were all reading it. So, whether you're mocking him or praising him, Shakespeare in this time is always described as sweet. And the next paragraph, top of the next page, Francis Mears looks at Shakespeare as a playwright. And if you can identify which of the Shakespeare plays mentioned here we no longer have the text of, please post that in the chat. Mears says, as Plautus and Seneca are counted the best for comedy and tragedy among the Latins, so Shakespeare among the English is the most excellent in both kinds for the stage. For comedy, witness his Gentleman of Verona, his Errors, Love's Labour's Lost, Love's Labour's Won, Midsummer Night's Dream, Merchant of Venice. For tragedy is Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, King John, Titus Andronicus, and his Romeo and Juliet. And it looks like Travis typed in Love's Labour's Won, and MGC did the same. Love's Labour's Won. Yes. We don't know what happened to the text of that, but it didn't make it into the First Folio of 1621. Am I right, Ed? Okay.
23 is the folio. There are some people that think that Much Ado About Nothing could be Love's Labour's Won, just under a different title. But we don't have a play called that.
So this passage, Mears wraps it up by comparing Shakespeare to the Muses, the goddesses of poetry and the arts. In the third paragraph, he says, as Epius Stolo, a Roman orator, in this time period, endless references to the ancient world. As Epius Stolo said that the Muses would speak with Plautus's tongue if they would speak Latin, so I say that the Muses would speak with Shakespeare's fine-filed phrase if they would speak English. Shakespeare was 34 years old when he came out. This was 1598, and I expect that he would have seen this. Someone would have shown this to him. Look at what Francis Mears wrote about you. Francis Mears loved Shakespeare, and for that, we love Francis Mears. So, Ed, how are we doing in chat? Any questions in here?
No questions now. Okay.
So, let's look at a poor soul from this same time period who didn't love Shakespeare. This is the, we think, rival playwright Robert Greene. Though right off the bat, I should say, in Greene's defense, many, if not most scholars, doubt that Robert Greene actually wrote this. So that's confusing. It might have been Henry Chettle, who was a writer and a playwright and a printer. I'm going to say Greene just to make this simpler. But when I say Greene, when I say Robert Greene, try to hear quotes around that because we are just not sure. The full title of this is Greene's Groatsworth of Repentance. Greene's Groatsworth of Wit, bought with $1 million of repentance, describing the folly of youth, the falsehood of makeshift flatterers, the misery of the negligent, and mischiefs of deceiving courtesans, i.e. prostitutes, written before his death and published at his dying request. So Greene's Groatsworth of Wit, bought with $1 million of repentance. A groat was a coin worth about a nickel. So the title here is saying, as sorry as you may be for your youthful mistakes, you still don't have any sense. That clever, cynical, hopeless sentiment is the mood of the entire book. Green's Grossworth is a genre we still have today, unlike the Francis Mears book. This is a short, goofy, bitter narrative that takes shots at contemporaries. It absolutely is in the same vein as a Family Guy or a South Park episode. It is the exact same thing. Our edition is not the original. It's not the first edition. We have one from 1617, the year after Shakespeare died at age 52. The book was originally published in 1692 when Shakespeare was 28, and it may be the first ever printed reference to Shakespeare, even before Francis Mears. At this time, Shakespeare was an actor. He had written a lot of his history plays, 5 comedies, 2 tragedies. So the famous passage in here where Shakespeare gets his takedown, he gets called an upstart crow. Let's zoom in.
Andrew, that original was 1592, right?
Wait, what did I say?
Well, I think it's 1592. So yeah,
I did. Yeah, right. It is 1592. I said 1692. Thank you, Ed. So you can see where the arrow here points to a colon. That's where the passage starts, and it ends where the arrow points up to that little space. And Green possibly says, "For there is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum is in his own conceit the only shake scene," get it? Shake scene in a country. So what's going on here? Upstart crow beautified with our feathers suggests a thief. What is Shakespeare a thief of? Green says he supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the rest of you. Blank verse is poetry with meter, rhythm, but no rhyme. Not its originator, but the first English playwright to become known for using blank verse was Christopher Marlowe, who was born 2 months before Shakespeare. Like Robert Greene, Christopher Marlowe was university educated, whereas Shakespeare was not. So we think there's a little bit of snobbery here. Shakespeare did have a good education up to age 14 and would have been familiar with drama. His father, John Shakespeare, was an alderman, basically the mayor of Stratford. So we're fairly sure Shakespeare went to the Stratford Grammar School, where his teacher would have been Thomas Jenkins, who had been a student in London of the author and teacher Richard Mulcaster, who advocated teaching through drama and acting. So you can kind of see possibly how Shakespeare, if you need an explanation, could have gotten this into his blood. But Shakespeare was an actor, a player, and that was not a respected profession at this time. So Green is saying, don't use our literary devices, you upstart, you lowly player. Tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. In a different font there, you'll see. It's a quote from Shakespeare's early history play, Henry VI, Part 3 from 1591. It's still performed, but not so often. In this passage, the Duke of York is calling Margaret of Anjou, quote, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide." Margaret of Anjou, just to give you a little background here, in the George R.R. Martin, York, Stark, Lancaster, Lannister equivalency is Cersei Lannister. The Duke of York is Ned Stark, so here the author is using an insult from a Shakespeare play against Shakespeare. Next, Green calls Shakespeare an absolute Johannes factotum, in italics there, which basically means a jack of all trades. He's a hybrid actor-playwright. He does everything, quote, and his own conceit, the only shake scene in a country. So Green, if this was Green, whoever wrote this, is the only Shakespeare contemporary to accuse Shakespeare of bad character. There are lots of great legends about why Green supposedly likes Shakespeare, but in the passage here, it's clearly snobbery. A mere lowly actor should not aspire to be a writer. So, Francis Mears really adored Shakespeare. Green really disliked Shakespeare. How are we doing in chat? Ed, do we have any questions?
No questions. Go ahead.
Okay. So, the book that might be a key to what Shakespeare was thinking and feeling at this time, though of course we don't know, is his sonnets. And we have just about the worst possible edition of Shakespeare's sonnets. It's certainly beautiful. This copy is a beautifully rebound volume. This edition of the Sonnets was published in 1640. It's the second edition. The original was published in 1609. This was published by John Benson, not Ben Jonson, John Benson. Here's the spine of the 1640 edition. Here is the front, and even the end papers are these just stunning, lovely, just this fine work, these lovely end papers. Other than that, the title page...
Just as a reminder, Andrew, for people who aren't familiar, this is not the way the book was published at the time and would have been put out. This is a later binding, isn't that right?
Exactly, yeah. Collectors were always rebinding their work. So on the Antiques Roadshow, the worst thing in the world you can do is refinish a piece of furniture. In rare books, the story is kind of different. This would have been bought from the printer in just a flimsy paper wrapper, and you would have taken it to get it reprinted according to your budget and according to your taste. So collectors have always felt free to rebind their books up until books published in the Victorian age. So here is the last thing that Shakespeare might have liked about this edition. It describes him as a gentleman. He was the son of a glove maker, which is a fine trade, but still a trade. He was a former actor. Shakespeare, by the way this era looked at class, was not a gentleman, but he had persisted in trying to get a coat of arms for his family. He was denied. In the end, he succeeded, and when he died, he was a prosperous man who had risen in the world. That is the last thing about this book that Shakespeare, if he had ever found it or ever had leafed through it as a ghost, would have liked. Let's take a look at what John Benson does with the sonnets. This is Sonnet 44, and immediately we can see that something is wrong because Shakespeare's sonnets did not have titles. The second thing we can see that's wrong is just moving in here. What kind of monstrosity is this? A 28-line long sonnet. Sonnets are supposed to be 14 lines. This is Sonnet 44 and Sonnet 45 mashed together. Think of it as kind of being like two cartoon characters in a trench coat. We think that this is because sonnets were less popular in 1640 than they had been in 1609. Maybe. We're not totally sure about that. So there's plenty of evidence that John Benson is not such a great editor, that he messed with the poems, he's a bit slapdash, maybe calculating, maybe both. I think we all agree on that. What we can't agree on is, was John Benson a homophobe? Did he straight wash the sonnets? So this is sonnet number 113. And it's one of the first 126 sonnets written for a beautiful young man who's commonly referred to as the Faire Youth. This is something scholars have mostly agreed on since the time of Shakespeare. Scholarship began in the 18th century. Some of the most lovely and most romantic sonnets are part of the first 126, the Faire Youth sequence. So think about, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. The sonnets that tend to get used at weddings. These were written for a man. Scholars are in agreement about this. Why does this poem suggest, why does the title suggest that it's about a woman? John Benson has his defenders who say, hey, he wasn't a hater, he just wasn't such a good editor. We don't really know what's going on here, but you can draw your own conclusions. In terms of him just being a bit slapdash, you can see here that some of the descriptions of Shakespeare's beloved as a man made it into this edition. This one starts with the words, Lord of my love. This is Sonnet 26, given a title, A Dutiful Message. Looks like it escaped the straight washing. Shakespeare also calls the fair youth of the sonnets my love, my sweet love, my lovely boy, master and mistress of my passion. 20th century critics like to say that this was how Renaissance British poets gushed over their non-romantic same-sex friends. A little bit dubious, the scholar and Christian apologist C.S. Lewis was, whom we think of as the Narnia guy. He was definitely uncomfortable with the same-sex content of the sonnets, but he said, their language was, quote, too lover-like for that of ordinary male friendship. I have found no real parallel to such language between friends in 16th century literature. That's from the 1954 English literature in the 16th century. Back to John Benson. Here is Sonnet 101, centipeded onto the end of another one. This sonnet, O Truant Muse, it's usually Exhibit A in the argument that Benson was straightwashing Shakespeare, but even in this, even in the Exhibit A of straightwashing, we still see this slapdash comical approach. The pink arrows here are where Shakespeare heteroized, or where Benson, heteroized male pronouns to female, but the blue arrows show you where he just couldn't be bothered and left the male pronouns in. So this brings us to, where is Shakespeare in all of this? How did Shakespeare feel about falling in love with a man? This is Sonnet 20 with the title that Benson gave at the Exchange, and I'll read part of this for you. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou, the master mistress of my passion. So you're both sexes at once. You're two sexes at once here. Jumping ahead to line 7, the beloved is described as a man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. So the fair youth is attractive to both men and women. For a woman wert thou first created, till nature as she wrought thee, as she made thee, fell a doting, wasn't paying attention, like John Benson. And by addition of me, of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. But since she, nature, pricks thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use their treasure. So that second to last line means exactly what you think it means. The sonnets are full of this kind of sexy double meaning. A lot of it slips by modern ears. But if you keep in mind while you're reading the sonnets that words like nothing, proud, and even will had pretty graphic second meanings at this time, the sonnets enter another dimension. One last look at Sonnet 20. We'll see how the word hue and hues are used here. And then also looking ahead at Sonnet 135, you can see how the word will appears 10 times in one sonnet. So there's speculation that Shakespeare's referring to himself, he's referring to his beloved, and will also mean something different in kind of the racy underground slang of the Elizabethan age. The use of will and the use of hues in the sonnets, and the dedication of the first edition of the sonnets to a mysterious Mr. W.H., either from Shakespeare or the publisher Thomas Thorpe, we don't know, leads to speculation that the fair youth was a man called Willie Hughes. Oscar Wilde picked up this idea in a short story, The Portrait of Mr. W.H., and the Rosenbach has some manuscript material relating to this short story in Wilde's hand, which you see here. James Joyce then picks that up in his Ulysses in the Scylla and Charybdis episode, which takes place in the National Library of Ireland, where the characters rehash. For a Shakespeare fan, just read this chapter. It's so fun because every single rumor or legend about Shakespeare that you ever heard of is in the Scylla and Charybdis episode of Ulysses. In the National Library of Ireland, you can see a page of that here, and then up close, the discussion in the library moves around to Oscar Wilde's take on who the fair youth of the sonnet was. Here's the passage enlarged. The most brilliant of all is that story of Wilde's, Mr. Best said, The Portrait of Mr. W.H., where he proves that the sonnets were written by a Willie Hughes, a man all hues. For Willie Hughes, is it not? The Quaker librarian asked. So we don't know what James Joyce thought about this. Oscar Wilde definitely put his cards on the table in his story, The Portrait of Mr. W.H. Scholars today have shifted from the low-born Willie Hughes theory to theories that the fair youth was a noble. But a word of warning, the poet W.H. Auden says that identifying the characters in the sonnets is nonsensical. It is, quote, An idiot's job, pointless and uninteresting. It is just gossip. But still, gossip is irresistible. So, one last theory. Speaking of straight washing, the movie Shakespeare in Love, written by playwright Tom Stoppard, where the Faire Youth was actually Gwyneth Paltrow in disguise all along. So there's a little last bit of straight washing with you, and we've put some links in chat to give you a little bit of guidance on where to start explaining this topic. And take it away, Ed.
Thank you. I was wondering how you were going to get Shakespeare. For everyone watching, I knew that Shakespeare in Love slide was in there. I didn't know how he was going to tie that in. I was wondering what that was. So that's it. I'd forgotten that bit of it, that is that Stoppard ties that in. She's the Faire Youth. That's wonderful. Thank you all in the audience for attending tonight. You can go to the Rosenbach website and see all kinds of things about what we have just posted now. There's other videos and there's blog posts galore on our site. And we also have some upcoming programs that you might be interested in, including a Book Arts Behind the Bookcase tour, the artistry and industry of bookmaking, that one of our colleagues will lead to show you some of the beautiful bindings that we have, some illuminated medieval manuscripts that we have. And there is also the Rosenbach and we also have courses, including a Shakespeare-related course called Shakespeare on Film with Gage Johnston. Gage is a documentary filmmaker from Philadelphia, and this course will start on April 14th. It'll meet bi-weekly, and she will examine 2 films from each of these 4 plays here: Hamlet, Much Ado About Nothing, Romeo and Juliet, and Macbeth. And she'll show scenes during the class and talk about how filmmakers adapt Shakespeare and the specific things they do on film in order to bring meaning out of the text, as opposed to what happens on stage. So that course is also coming up, and the Rosenbach is also open. You can get time tickets for your visit, just one party at a time. You can check out our new exhibition on the 19th century Japanese sailor Manjiro and see our newly renovated garden in back. We have the flowers and plants. We put together a garden collections guide that is, the flowers and plants that are out there now are themed to our collections. And if you are looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out the other virtual offerings we have, including our gallery gateways and exhibitions. And I want to thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you for supporting the Rosenbach. If you are not already a member, I invite you to join us and become a member. Members get 10% off all courses. They get 50% off programs. But I also encourage you to make a donation. Any amount helps. You just go to our webpage, rosenbach.org, click on the support tab. Your support helps the Rosenbach continue to create programs like this and also to care for our collections. So thank you, everyone, tonight. Thanks for joining us. I hope I will see you at another program. Andrew, thank you for doing this with me, or thank you for allowing me to do this with you, is honestly what I should say. So it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, sir. And I can stick around a little bit and see if we have any questions to be answered. So it looks like we have some nice posts in the chat from Don and Anna and Nathan, Anne, Debbie, and Roslyn. So thanks everybody for coming.
If you guys want to rewatch this, we've also streamed it live on Facebook while we're doing it. So if you're on Facebook, you can go to the Rosenbach's Facebook page and see this again. If there was something you were so engrossed in, you didn't hear what was being said, you can go back and rewatch it there. Thank you, everyone. Good night. And I hope to see you at the Rosenbach soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.